Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Daniel. We're continuing to look at Daniel chapter 11, containing the fourth vision of the prophet Daniel. Now, we saw in yesterday's session that this part of Daniel's vision concerns continuing war between Syria under the Seleucid dynasty and Egypt under the dynasty of the Ptolemies. They kind of warred back and forth between each other, and of course the land of Israel was in between. Remember I told you when it talks about the kings of the north, they're talking about the Syrians under the Seleucids. When it talks about the kings of the south, they're talking about the Egyptians under the Ptolemies. Now these two kingdoms endured from about 323 BC until the middle of the 1st century BC, until the time that the Roman Empire was established. So this vision covers a 2.5 century period of time of these continuing wars between Syria and Egypt. Now, of particular interest to us in this vision is again the focus on the person we have called the Old Testament Antichrist. We've identified him before as Antiochus Epiphanes, one of the Seleucid rulers of Syria, who vented war against the people of Israel from about 167 to 164 BC. This Old Testament Antichrist, this Antiochus Epiphanes, is mentioned in this vision, chapter 11, in verses 29 and following. It says, "At the appointed time, he will invade the south again." That is, Antiochus invaded Egypt, trying to conquer it. But the outcome will be different from what it was before. Ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, and he will lose heart. Now, this actually happened. Antiochus attempted an invasion of Egypt, and he was thwarted and turned back. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. He will return and show favor to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Now, this is exactly what happened. After his failed attempt to take Egypt, he came back, and on his way through the Promised Land, he came to Jerusalem, and there he began war against the Jewish people. He basically outlawed Judaism and tried to exterminate the Jewish practice of faith, their worship of God. Verse 31, "His armed forces will rise up and desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice." He forbid the Jews to sacrifice and worship God. "Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation." We've seen this before. This is where he desecrated the temple by offering a sacrifice to Zeus on the altar, and the sacrifice he offered was that of a pig. It desecrated the temple. "With flattery, he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him." So Daniel saw what Antiochus would do, how he would try to destroy the faith of God's people, but how there would be resistance. And there was under the people called the Maccabees, who rose up in revolt against Antiochus, and after 3.5 years they threw him off. Now we see this is mentioned several times in the visions of Daniel. This little horn, this Antichrist, we see him in the Old Testament manifest in Antiochus Epiphanes. But what Antiochus did was simply a foreshadowing of the Antichrist who will come at the end of time, who will attempt to destroy the church and destroy the people of God. So what Antiochus did in the Old Testament times against the Jewish people, a future Antichrist will do against the people of God toward the end. All of this is foretold in the book of Daniel. Now tomorrow, as we continue our 5-minute study, we will begin looking at chapter 12, which is the final part of Daniel's fourth vision, and will be the concluding chapter of the book of Daniel. So we're almost to the end of Daniel, and we'll begin looking at that chapter 12 tomorrow. So I hope you'll join us for our next session in our 5-minute Bible study in the book of Daniel.